Good afternoon, everyone. Chris Gantt-Sorenson with Haynsworth, Sinkler Boyd coming to you during Women's History Month with a very exciting program today. We're going to be talking about women in leadership roles, women in the workplace, and the impact of pandemic on women in South Carolina particularly. So excited about the presenters we have today. So let's get started. As always, questions that you have, drop them in the chat, drop them in the Q&A. We're going to be picking them up as we go along. Would also love to hear your comments. Today, I have with me April Simpkins and Brandi Parrish Ellison. April is a national DEI presenter. She presents for Urban League and Society of Human Resource Management nationally. She just got back from Ohio and some other places this week presenting, and so we're excited to have her. She's also the Chief Human Resource Officer for Total HR. Glad to have April with us. And then Brandi. Brandi is the Senior Director of Policy and Programs with WREN, the Women's Rights Empowerment Network of South Carolina. And y'all may remember Brandi kicked off our first DEI series back in August of last year for Pay Equity Day, Women's Pay Equity Day. And so we're glad to have Brandi here to talk about what WREN's been up to this year. So next slide, please, Brittany. Some of the things we're going to cover today, you'll see here on the screen. And I'm going to go ahead and get started on the 2021 Women in the Workplace report from the McKinsey Group and Lean-In. So next slide. So McKinsey and Lean-In, they put out a Women in the Workplace report annually, and you can see they gather their information from a number of employers and the employees that they're highlighting in the report. So they spoke to a number of women in the workplace, and they also concentrated on intersectionalities of women who had additional diversity categories, women of color, LGBTQ plus women, and women with disabilities in the workplace. And this data was comprised in the report. I've linked to the report. I'm going to hit some of the highlights today. Next slide. So one of the first things to point out is that women remain underrepresented, especially in positions of management in corporate America. And so you have a chart here to the right, and you'll see the categories of employment: entry level, manager, senior manager, VP, senior VP, and C-suite. And then you're going to see the categories of white men, men of color, white women, women of color. And you'll see that once we get outside of entry level and into manager, you're going to see the women percentages drop, and particularly the women of color, especially the women of color. And so you can see where there are the barriers of entry to women, particularly in the workplace, and then specifically women of color. Next slide. So another thing that the women were polled about that fell into the women in the workplace and then to the intersections that were discussed, and race, disabilities, and LGBTQ plus were just some of them, the report covers all of them, is they were asked about what were the most common experiences that they had in the workplace that implicated them on the basis of their gender and or the other unique characteristics. And it's important to remember that every single one of them reported unique characteristics associated with their intersectionality. So those were different as well. And so again, a great chart, and I'll explain it briefly. So if you look at the middle category, the white category, you're going to see the two areas that were analyzed and that were reported on: challenges to competence and disrespectful and othering behavior. And then you're going to have on the left-hand side the categories of all men, all women, LGBTQ plus women, and women with disabilities. On the right-hand side, you're going to see the breakdown of race of the women in the workplace: white women, Asian women, Latinas, and Black women. And so let's tackle some of these common issues. The first, under challenges to competence, being interrupted or spoken over more than others. This happened to more women than men, so start on the left-hand side. It happened more to LGBTQ plus women and women with disabilities. On the right-hand side, in the race category, this happened the most of the white, Asian, and Latinas and Black women at work. It happened most to the Black women. The next common issue, having your judgment questioned. This happened more to the women and the men. It happened more to the LGBTQ plus women and the women with disabilities. And in the race category, significantly more to women of color, Black women. In the last issue that was common, that was discussed, having others comment on your emotional state, more to women than men, more to LGBTQ plus women and women with disabilities, and more to Black women on the race aspect of it. Interestingly, the highest percentage was women with disabilities. They had their emotional states commented on. And remember, emotional states often can be evidence of actually a disability, an ADA protected disability. So then under disrespectful and othering behavior, hearing people express surprise at your language skills or other abilities. This happened more to men and women, that was a smaller gap, more to LGBTQ plus women and women with disabilities, substantially more to Black women. And, we all still hear some of those. And I know that April's going to talk about some of those common microaggressions, but it's important that we all, as leaders in our workplace, continue to educate ourselves on what are considered microaggressions so that we are trying to avoid stepping in it. Next is hearing or overhearing insults about your culture or people like you. So same for men and women, white men and women. Then you look at more for LGBTQ plus women, more for women with disabilities, and the highest number was women, Black women in the workplace. The next is being confused with someone else of the same race and ethnicity. The striking percentages there are the Black women and the Asian women. This happened to those women in the workplace. Those are the highest percentages. The next one, feeling like you were expected to speak on behalf of all people with your identity. It was more for women than men, more for LGBTQ women, and substantially more than double for Black women. The last, having others comment on your hair or your appearance, more for LGBTQ plus women and women with disabilities, and the highest percentage again, Black women. So you can see that we've got a lot of work to do in our workplaces. Next slide. And Black women also face disproportionately higher barriers in the workplace. We just went through the microaggressions that they're subjected to more than the other women in the workplace and other intersections of women. The big issue that the report pointed out, two issues. One is that although women of color are supported by other women when it comes time to advocate for them, women in the workplace don't. And that has to happen. That has to happen. I don't know why it doesn't happen. The report discusses some of those aspects, but women in the workplace are reluctant to advocate for women of color and to mentor women of color. So you look at the chart. This is another chart that discusses the level of the infiltration of women, and then women with intersectionalities, and then Black women into the higher levels of management. And it paints the same story that we saw above. All the little white squares or the gray squares are white people. And then the A's are Asian, the L's are Latinx, and the B are Black. And you can see what happens to the women as we go up the levels. So I think the takeaway from this, if you had to have one takeaway from this report, is that while workplaces and employers and businesses are expressing growing commitment to racial equity, that the day-to-day experience of women of color in the workplace is not changing and needs to. So at this time, we're going to do 3 poll questions, and then we'll slide on to the rest of the report and to the rest of the presentation. So take your time to answer these. Please do answer them, and then we're going to report back on your responses. So thoughts, April, Brandi, on these poll questions. What do you think? Are most workplaces committed to DEI efforts on some level, but have not advanced beyond hiring diverse candidates and tracking statistics? Thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's a lot of well-meaning organizations, companies that have external values that they present, but a lot of times are lacking the tools and resources or the accountability to implement more deeply within their organization.
Right. I think that, yep. Go ahead, April.
It seems that for most organizations, not all, the goal is to see a diverse workforce. And as if the effort stops there, like they're here. But in actuality, a space should already be made for those you are attempting to hire so that they can easily come and integrate themselves into the culture in the workplace. And so, I think when we look at a diverse hiring strategy, really the question ought to be, what is your company doing right now regarding inclusion? What are you doing right now to understand and promote equity in the organization so that the new hire isn't now forced to clear a path? There's a path that's been made for them.
That's an excellent point. Excellent point. And I will say, if you see an area where you're underrepresented in your workplace, you need to look internally versus the workplace. And that's exactly what April is saying. You need to figure out why that is inside before you start bringing in more people, creating bad blood among the new employee, as well as outside who they're talking to. And Brandi, to your point, we're attending a lot of, the three of us attend a lot of meetings with HR professionals, high-level HR folks, and I hear that question over and over again: how do we do it? How do we do it? So I know Brittany's given folks a little more time to answer. The last one was interesting, and I just wanted to mention that. The last question, Brittany, can you, here we go. So we'll just go ahead and hit them. Here's the results of the poll. So 60% agree that beyond the hiring statistics and tracking statistics, that companies are not pushing the strategy. They don't have a diverse hiring, beyond diverse hiring strategy. They don't have more than that. The next one, a lot of employers don't know how to begin the discussion. And when I was going to make the comment that in regards to the last question, that's largely true because lawyers like me through the years have told them not to talk about it.
Exactly.
That was the thinking. Don't talk about it.
Exactly.
Don't mention it. Shouldn't come up. And in the process, we've chilled communication, and that's the very communication that's going to move the ball forward. So I realized the error of my ways here. So answer to number 2, they don't know how to talk about it. 57% said no, 43% said yes. Okay, and then the last question, are we able to slide to that, Brittany? I'm not seeing that. Are y'all seeing that?
Yeah, you just scroll down on that bar.
Thank you. Thank you for helping. The last one is 75% agree that they haven't said anything because all of us were telling them not to.
Right.
So thank y'all. Thank you. Any other thoughts you want to add, Brian? Sorry, April or Brittany? Sorry, I'm trying to do too many things at once. I know your names. April and Brandi, anything you want to add before I slide on to the rest of my presentation?
Yeah, just that I would double down on what you said, especially after Title VII came into the workplace. We were taught not to make workplace decisions based on anything that's protected class. And the whole concept of equity flips that on its head by saying you need to provide for people what they need to reach the same end goal. And that doesn't look like equality, it looks like equity. And if you're not trained to understand those differences, you'll be afraid to broach that at all.
Yeah, great point. Brandi?
I'll just add that there are some really great advocacy organizations in our state that represent the groups that are listed here in these questions that do trainings. So the trainings are coming from people who identify as these different, that hold these different identities that are offering the trainings. And I think that is really important because you need to learn and hear from the people that represent these different demographics. And again, there are many organizations in our state that do that. So at a very costly level. Mm-hmm.
No, that's great. And, I think everybody, Brandi, if you'd be willing to provide that information to the specific employers who are interested in it, y'all reach out to Brandi. Contact information for both of all of us is at the end of the slide. So please do that. All right. So let's slide on. Next slide, please, Brittany. All right, so since 2017 and then through George Floyd, there's been a reckoning that's been triggered on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And more workplaces than ever are interested, devoted, and committed to DEI in the workplace. But who's doing the work? And so this report indicated that it was generally women. So women leaders are stepping up and rising to the occasion, and they've been taking on additional duties during the pandemic and in regards to the DEI efforts. And that was because typically women managers found themselves more concerned with employee well-being, making sure employees are balancing workplace home life. And DEI is a very significant part of employee well-being. The problem is that this work is not being acknowledged and it's not being compensated. And so the report said something that I found pretty profound, that employers and businesses are going to have to acknowledge and compensate this work, or it is going to get relegated to the critical work is going to get relegated to office housework. And that really resonated with me. And so, workplaces understand the value in DEI as a business perspective, But if that is an important perspective and you acknowledge that as a business, then you need to compensate and you need to acknowledge it. Next slide. So, last chart for me. These are some examples and some ideas and some things that are put forward in the report that workplaces can do. And of course, you should be tracking. Everybody already tracks, right? Track your intersections as well. Track your women who have other intersections. Track other employees who have other intersections. That's going to give you a deeper dive into what's going on in your workplace. Hold your senior leaders accountable for progress on diversity goals and financial incentives and penalties. If you don't do that as a business, then it's never going to have value. What you pay for and what you promote on and what you acknowledge is what's going to get done. And then the last thing I'm going to mention is mentorship and sponsorship. I think that is integral. I am a fan of workplaces tend to have the same standard training formally across the board, but when it comes to where somebody really excels, it's the informal, who are you helping up? People tend to historically help up people who look like them, think like them, same demographic. And so, in that scenario, if you have an underrepresented minority in your workplace and they're not seeing people that are at the top, who's helping them up? So identify the folks that are good mentors in your workplace. The worst you can do is attach a mentor that's a bad mentor and who's not going to help, much less chill the mentee. Pick people who are effective mentors. Have them mentor the mentees and tie compensation and acknowledgement to that as well. And so I think that's crucial. And I hear you weighing in, April. Any thoughts? No?
I don't have anything to add. I mean, I agree with everything you said.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think it's so important, the mentorship. And too many times I hear of situations where employees are mentored by somebody who has chilled them, who has not helped them, and who's made them feel isolated. And so that's bad for the workplace, that's bad for the employee, and that's going to also be bad for anyone who they talk to. So now I'm going to kick it to Brandi, and she's going to talk to you about what's been happening with WREN, and then we'll hear from April. And in the meantime, we're going to drop some questions in the chat, so be looking for those.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Hi, everyone. My name is Brandi Parrish Ellison, and I am with the Women's Rights and Empowerment Network. For those of you that joined us last year at the kickoff, it's great to see you all again. I'm excited for those of you that don't know WREN, let me share a little bit. The Women's Rights and Empowerment Network, WREN, is a nonprofit organization that is statewide in South Carolina, and our mission is to build a movement to advance the health, economic well-being, and rights of women, girls, gender expansive people, and their families. So we do this through our policy advocacy work, our educational work. We do a lot of coalition building with our partners, and as well as mobilizing constituents around any of the topics that WREN takes on, whether it be at the policy level, at the State House, or with local businesses or communities. So next slide, please. So today I'm going to talk about our economic work, because we just released some really awesome research that I'm excited to share with you. We have a body of work called Power Up, Igniting a Resilient and Gender Equitable Workforce in South Carolina. And Power Up is actually a series or a collection of reports, research, and other tools that WREN is using to address workplace inequities in South Carolina. And the goal of that work is to, center women as a solution in the workforce shortage that South Carolina is facing, because there are a lot of women who are out of the workforce right now who want to be working. So that's a very big untapped resource. And the second goal is to change workplace or shift workplace culture and policies so that it is more equitable, more family friendly, and really is inclusive of everyone. So none of these headlines should be surprising, right? So we are facing the pandemic has greatly impacted our workforce participation in our country and in our state. And overall, the share of Americans working is near the lowest level since the 1970s. And that is about 2.3 million fewer people working now than pre-pandemic. And of the 2.3 million fewer people working now, more than half of those are women. So early in the pandemic, it was clear that women were going to be hit extremely hard. We did an analysis in April of 2020 and found that there were more than 2/3 of frontline positions in our state were held by women. And in the healthcare support field, women held 90% of the frontline jobs. These were also the jobs that are high risk of contracting COVID or losing their jobs because of cut hours and business closures. More than 70% of those high-risk jobs were also workers who earned below average wages. So early on, it was clear, like the pandemic was going to have a big impact on a long-term, big impact on our labor market, and especially on women. And we realized that South Carolina did not have any specific analysis on that impact. And so that's where WREN went back to collaborating with one of the lead economists in our state, Dr. Joseph von Nussen, out of the Moore School of Business at USC, to do that analysis for us. Next slide, please. So women in the workforce, this analysis really hit on three major things. Women and men are not on equal footing pre-pandemic, right? And the pandemic has induced a recession that has hit women the hardest and has affected the women-dominated areas the most. And really due to this, this kind of pull of women pulling out of the workforce for reasons that we'll discuss in a moment, the economy really cannot solve its labor shortage without figuring out ways to engage women back in the workforce. So now I'm going to share you some more specifics about that. Next slide. Okay, so you see here which industries, this is a chart of which industries were hit the hardest by the pandemic and which actually saw growth. So all of these were hit the hardest and then saw growth. So industries that were hit the hardest in the pandemic were those with predominantly a female workforce. There were three sectors that were hardest hit, including healthcare, education, and hospitality or food and accommodation. You'll see here that nearly 80% of the healthcare employment is women, 71.5% for education, and 51% for accommodations and food service or hospitality. So in addition to these, the recovery rates for these sectors, yes, they were hardest hit, but they also were very uneven in how they recovered. Out of the four sectors that we just discussed, or that surpassed the February 2020 employment levels, only one has a majority female workforce, and that's education. And I'm sure you have all read and seen that and know that our educators are under tremendous stress and many are considering leaving the workforce. So while that, schools went back and that workforce recovered, so to speak, There's a lot of really strong national data that shows that so many teachers are considering leaving education. Okay, the next slide. Okay, so because there's limited data at the state level, what we really had to do is look at unemployment claims to see how women and women of color were impacted by the pandemic. And you'll see here that obviously there's a disproportionately women were impacted. You'll see that the figure on the left shows the share of unemployment claims that were made by women. And then there are 3 periods of time that are shown there. And one is the decade-long expansion that preceded the pandemic, where women accounted for less than half of the unemployment claims. And then you'll see during the early and late stages of the pandemic, this percentage increased substantially to 55.1% and 56.2% respectively. And while that may not seem like a big jump, it actually is pretty significant departure from our historical trends. And we see this as an indication that women are having more difficulty returning to the workforce, and something very much to notice and realize that that is not recovering. The figure to the right highlights the share of unemployment claims from non-white individuals, and which also increased significantly in the late pandemic time here. So you can see the January 2010 to 2020 pre-pandemic, the early pandemic from March 2020 to March 21, and how those unemployment claims continue to increase. And we know that is the way it is because of the types of jobs that women are carrying and some of the roles and responsibilities, the issues that have been magnified due to the pandemic that have always been there, but have been magnified. Then can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so one of those areas where the impact or the responsibilities have amplified during the pandemic would be around childcare. It is a huge elephant in the room that has to be tackled in our state, and it's going to take every single person, whether they be a policymaker, a parent, a company owner, a neighbor. Everyone has a role to play in really addressing the childcare issues that we have in our state. So you'll see this. It shows basically that women took on more childcare responsibilities in the household when the pandemic happened, and that had to do a lot with the shutdown of daycares and the movement towards virtual learning. So if somebody had to stay home with the children, a lot of this fell mostly on the females in the household. We also know that in South Carolina, two-thirds of the households in South Carolina have a woman as a co or primary breadwinner. So the impact on the family of that parent stepping back and not working, that economic impact on the family, not only on our state's economy, is enormous. So this figure is from McKinsey as well. It was a really great study. Chris was just referring to it. It shows that women with young children were doing significantly more on childcare and daily work. You can see the impact that obviously that had on, in the blue, for people without children across to all, and then those that were under the age of 10. Okay, the next slide. So the bottom line is the figures show that the challenges that we are all experiencing as workers and as employers in our daily lives are adding up to huge threats to our economy as a whole. This is a major moment, right, where we can and have to address the inefficiencies and inequities in our labor market, and really change to ensure that we're not holding back progress for years to come. There's no denying the fact that our society has depended on women for the paid and unpaid work, and that is something that we have to recognize and have to value and have to address in our policies, in our work culture, and then the ways that we attract, hire, and retain employees. And again, this is just really important that as all people in our communities, our community is really has to work together on these workforce solutions in order to engage more women in the workforce. And there are a lot of people in our workforce that are in our state that are moving into our state, but most of them, WREN hosted a Power Up forum on Monday this week. We had about 80 business leaders in the room, and we had some really good discussion around the research that was just introduced or that I just shared with you. And we had a panel discussion on the challenges and opportunities around engaging more women in the workforce. And we had leaders from different industries across the state that engaged in this discussion. And we had a very candid, courageous conversations-based discussion around what this means. And, you know, part of the participation with that was to have folks in the room kind of respond to things as you all are doing right now. And so one of the questions and I want to share this with you, because one of the questions we posed is, why did so many women leave the workforce during the pandemic? And you'll see childcare is a huge piece of this. School, safety, mental health, layoff, finances, children, exhaustion, flexibility, stress, low pay, poor managers, kids out of school, like all of these are burnout, their motherhood, changing goals, work-life balance. But again, these are all things that were affecting women's participation and parents' participation in the workforce from before the pandemic. And again, the pandemic has just amplified that. And as people, because we do have a labor force shortage, as people are considering returning to work, a lot of people are looking at what is my workplace going to be like, or what do I want out of my workplace, and what do I need in order to balance the needs of my family or my personal needs and my workplace needs. So these are issues that we hear more and more at WREN that are coming up as we collaborate with our community and business partners. That people want more flexible schedules. They want to be able to have access to paid leave or paid sick leave or paid parental leave. They want pay equity, and they want more than just a external expression of values, an actual internal implementation of those values, and to see it. And I think, April, you said something earlier in this discussion that I wrote it down because I thought it was really, really wonderful. Like, new staff don't have to clear the path needs to be cleared. And I think that is what people are looking for. And they want to know that there is vested interest and that there are pathways to not only advancement, but to be able to sustain these jobs. And it's competitive. So you'll see more and more of that happening. My next slide. I just went through it, y'all. I just skipped ahead myself. So here again, so one of the other questions we asked is, what resources do you need? For the people in the room, the business leaders in the room, various industries. We had manufacturing, finance, education. We had people that were in hospitality and a number of other, construction even, in the room. And what many of them said at all different levels of their managerial levels within the organization: training, trust and open-mindedness. And I'm just going to pick a few here. Sponsorships, which Chris talked about earlier, which is different from mentorships. More data on it, living wages, representation at decision-making levels. You want to see yourself in that and feel like you're a part of it. Courageous conversations, and policies that align with values. So again, just reiterating some of the things that, so there's that resource need, and like companies are saying, this is what I need. I want to be able to influence as an individual, and what I want our company to be able to provide. Next. So our next steps with Power Up are we're going to be hosting smaller industry specific conversations around different topics that are under the promoting women's, advancing women's participation in the workforce, and what DEI means for your organization, or DEIB, right, which is something that was used at our forum the other day, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And then also looking at what is happening in different geographic settings as far as, there are different industry clusters in different regions of our state, and how does that impact participation in the workforce. We would love to continue to partner with with organizations and folks that are doing this work. Obviously, you all are very woven into the fabric of your organizations and care so much about what DEI looks like for your organization. And there is this great desire to share, right? To share what is working in your company. It's amazing some of the examples that came up at the forum, just small policy changes. Yes, not one change makes the big difference, but there were really creative ideas that kind of surfaced. And so what WREN really would like to do is create that space to help share some of those very creative ideas and push people outside of their comfort zones. What are the temporary things that we've been doing that can be long-term? What are the things that are doing in this industry that might work for ours? And what are happening because companies within industries also are tackling in different ways. So there's this great need to share and to collaborate and to be innovative together. So we hope to continue to foster that in this work. We'll be releasing our Power Up Action Agenda, which will have the ask or challenges of people at the policy-making level, of employers and of the workforce. So that will be released next month, and I'll be happy to share that through Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandi. All right, April.
All right, I just took myself off of mute. So this slide that I want to talk about is something I typically will introduce anytime we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, because it is for some still a challenge and really don't understand what to say and what not to say. So the first thing I always say is learn how to create a safe space. And while I'm not going to go through all of the ins and outs of that, there are some resources that have done a great job at it. At the top of my list would definitely be Crucial Conversations or Difficult Conversations. And maybe that becomes some kind of book study or work or something that one of the employee resource groups uses as study or learning material. But learning how to create that is step one. And one thing that I've always emphasized is that learning to have difficult conversations should not be relegated only to the leadership team. Every person inside of the organization should receive training on this ongoing, because some of the conversations you have around diversity, equity, and inclusion might make people feel uncomfortable. So creating that safe space is so critical. And that brings me to my next point, which is get comfortable being uncomfortable. And as Chris and I mentioned earlier, and thank you, Chris, for leading that, is for many years, we've been told that some topics are just off limits in the workplace, especially if it's protected class, if it has to do with the protected class. And it makes us almost uncomfortable. And when I look at the broad spectrum of diversity, there are so many conversations that need to be had that we shy away from and leave it as an elephant in the room. Just to add a little more context to the concept of getting comfortable being uncomfortable, we have roughly five generations in the workplace, and I believe our older generation, the traditionalists, sometimes referred to as a silent generation, are certainly moving out. But the traditionalists and the baby boomers, many of them entered the workplace when Title VII was still being developed or had just come into place, which means that their opinions around women's work and men's work and people of color, specifically Black people, being in the workplace and taking on certain roles was ingrained, because there was no law to tell you that you could not do that. There was no rebuttal. And not only was that part of the thinking and trying to now adapt to how we do this and promote equality, those conversations go home and are shared around the dinner table, which brings you to Generation X, the next generation, who has now heard these conversations from a very small age, and it creates this unconscious bias for some in believing that somehow there is work that women should do and there's work that men should do. And, you know, for Black people or Black women to do this work, we don't know about that. And so because of that, we are still kind of dealing with this in the workplace. But now, because of DEI efforts, we are pushing forward intentional conversations around race and gender and sexual identity and orientation and disability, religion. It is now being pushed to the forefront. Get comfortable being uncomfortable, and learning to have those difficult conversations is imperative to doing that. And that brings me to my third point that I always make when I'm discussing DEI, and that is that we're going to make missteps. And we want to use those missteps as learning opportunities. If you say the wrong word or aren't sure, or you can't quite get your point across, be receptive to learning and be prepared for some to just gently explain maybe why there's a better way to say that, or we prefer not to use that title or label, and just be receptive to that. I often talk about the difference between impact and intent. And certainly it may not have been your intent to offend someone when you made this misstep, but the impact is that there was some kind of an offense, and we need to learn to do better. So I want to kind of preface it with that. I share that all the time around DEI conversations, and wanted to share that today.
So April,
yes.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
On the uncomfortable conversations, is it okay? Is this a good place to throw out a question that we have?
Yes, 100%.
Okay. So Nick, who is our managing partner, and good on Nick for asking this question. How do you distinguish between a tough, uncomfortable questions that help the process and those that are inappropriate? Or is that part of the process?
It can be part of the process, and that's where that learning opportunity comes into place. If it is inappropriate, we need to make sure that we share that and then make it a learning opportunity and explain the better way to ask that, or why we don't ask that, so that people are learning in the process and not getting their hands slapped, which will make them apprehensive to ask questions again. And then we end up with elephants in the room.
Right. Great answer. And I will tell you, and April and I have talked about this before, I was somebody who was very nervous to say anything for fear I'd say something wrong. I was just, chilled in it. And I had a discussion with Demetrius Pyburn in our office, and I said, he just made me feel better about it. He said, Chris, you're trying. The fact that you're trying. And he said, if someone gets really upset with you because you did it wrong, besides the fact that it's a learning opportunity, then they're not being very welcoming to you. You're trying. We're just glad, specific groups of minorities are all glad when advocates, and that's what we were talking about earlier from the report, advocates take up our issue and help advocate for us. We all need to be advocating for others. We don't need to expect that the people in the groups themselves should be advocating. So, but I needed to hear that. And that was only a couple of years ago.
Yeah, very true. Very true. And advocating is difficult, especially if you are afraid that you're going to make that misstep. And especially, I've noticed in the white community, it's a little tougher. And I say this because I've heard it and I've witnessed it, that as a white person, when you begin to advocate strongly for mistreatment of Black people, men and women in the white community, you get some ugly labels, and that can make it very difficult to work through that. Some are called race traitors and other disparaging names. And so that can be kind of scary while you're trying to process in your head, should I do this, or is that what that is? And again, that's all sometimes language that is born generation to generation and shared at the dinner table or in private meetings. And now you're going kind of counter to what you've heard. So I understand that, but in the workplace, we need to be team each other, and we need to be able to advocate for each other and be each other's ally. Next slide. So I'm going to just kind of generalize diversity, equity, inclusion, and I'm going to go into microaggressions and why they are problematic. Celebrating uniqueness, and I dive a little bit into this on the microaggression. Sometimes that celebrating uniqueness brings forth questions that can sometimes be challenging. And so in saying that, again, be prepared to learn and receive what might become offensive. But diversity is really celebrating uniqueness. I was once asked by a gentleman who owns a company who only had about 6 people, wasn't planning to grow his company, and the other people were all white men like him. And his question was, how do we incorporate diversity? Like, when we do start to grow, is someone going to want to come and work here? And I told him that the time to start is literally right now. That even though you may not be looking to hire, I bet you still purchase things. How about you declare 10% of your purchasing and dealings with vendors go to people in the BIPOC community? How about you reserve 6% of your training to come from people from the BIPOC community? Those are ways right now you can incorporate diversity. And in doing that, you build trust. And then people may refer others who they know to work for your company. So celebrating uniqueness. Equity is huge, and I often talk about equity, and that's where the challenge is. We were so focused on equality, giving everybody the same thing, assuming everyone's starting at the same place, and everyone is not. Honestly, as a Black female, when I enter the conversation, I've got to first explain hairstyles and the Black race in general, and what we, that's where I have to start in the beginning, while others are talking about substantive information like goals for the department and everything else. And it's because we just aren't trained to think of the equity side. So assume first everyone isn't starting in the same place. And if many households in the Black community are led by women, we're really not starting in the same place. And so what do you do to help? What do you do to support? And it's not going to look the same. I use this example a lot when it comes to equity and equality. If you had, I don't know how many people have ever had dinner with a minor child, like a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, or seen it. But if you have a table and you've got 4 adults who are going to sit at the table, and then there's a child who's 3 or 4, all 4 of those adults will sit at the table comfortably. We think nothing of offering that child a booster seat, or in my case, when I was young, phone books, but you think nothing of offering that child assistance to be able to reach the table so we're all equal. That's equity. It takes nothing away from the eating experience of the adults. It just allows that person to now eat at the table as well. And so as leaders in the organization, we really need to shift our thinking from equality to equity. How do we help you reach an end goal? And inclusion, really feeling a part at work. I have seen cases and experienced myself times when the organization looks diverse, but as a Black female, I have no voice. My opinion doesn't matter. I am silenced in the meetings. I'm not even asked to participate in the vote. I'm not given responsibilities. I'm just there. Well, that's diversity, but that has nothing to do with inclusion and making me feel like I'm valued and can contribute, and that, to Brandi's point, I belong there. So monitor that as well. And now I'll talk a little bit about some microaggressions. Specifically, I'm going to focus on microaggressions that Black women will feel in the workplace. And so the first one is assuming that all Black women have had the same life experience. I can tell you flat out, we are not a monolith. And it is uncomfortable when we go into a situation and we're viewed as the representative and then made to be everyone's Google. We're questioned on everything from, what do you think about, and they'll name some topic. What do you think about George Floyd? What do you think about the dress code. What do you think about? And it just goes on as if we're Google. And it's just not fair. And it is a microaggression. Ask about that person. Ask me about me, because the answer you'll get from 20 other Black women may be different. It doesn't make them wrong or me wrong. It's because we're different. The next one is tone policing. Black women, typically, just because of societal stereotypes and bias, are often referred to as aggressive or angry when we just speak up for ourselves or emphasize a point. And because of this bias and assumption, we're approached differently, which then makes us guarded, which gets interpreted as being aggressive. And I'll share with you a statement that was made by global publicist Brenda Gabriel. She said, "I remember once being informed by my white female manager that I was quite assertive in meetings. It was said in a way that indicated she wanted to say aggressive. And to be honest, Brandi didn't feel like she was being assertive enough. And as a project manager, she would attend team meetings and make suggestions for the way forward and be just completely ignored. And then 2 minutes later, a male counterpart would say the exact same thing and be cooed over and added to the action list, all of those suggestions." And so Black women have dealt with the angry stereotype for years. And it was actually a tactic used to stamp out our voices and keep us quiet. And so when you are listening to a woman of color, specifically a Black woman, focus a lot more on that content than the way you're trying to interpret what sometimes is really just confidence. The next one, expressing judgment regarding their appearance. And this really speaks a lot to our natural hair and the questions that we are asked. I know a number of Black women who, even when they wear their natural hair, someone who is not Black, typically someone who is white, will ask all kinds of questions about your hair. They want to touch your hair like you're a pet. And it's just not, it's not okay. It's inappropriate. And I know for many women in general, you would recoil or feel very uncomfortable if someone you didn't know just walked up to you and started running their fingers through your hair and complimenting you on the color or the style. It's just uncomfortable, and it's no different for us. And laws like the Crown Act have been implemented. It started in California in 2019. About 12 other states have adopted it. Some municipalities have got laws that are similar to it. But the fact that we now in 2019 have to create a law that says do not discriminate against someone, a Black person, because of the way their hair naturally grows from their scalp. Next one. Opportunity shaming, and I see and hear this a lot as well. Black women, especially as double minorities, we know intrinsically that if we want to advance in corporate, we have to be honestly twice as good as every other demographic. Like, we know that. We have to really bring it to move up the table. So the insult after all of our drive, our hard work and sacrifice being reduced to the diversity hire or an affirmative action hire, just pulling away and stripping us of all of our work to make that claim is demoralizing, and it's a microaggression that I hear a lot. People just dismiss that. They will say it in front of a Black person or a person of color, and they will say it in small groups behind their back to really discount all of their achievements that brought them to that place. So I can only say to that one, honestly, do better. And last, being told that you are so well-spoken or articulate. And I know that this isn't reserved just for us as Black women. There are other races that have heard this as well, and it just sounds a little different, but it is not the compliment that some may think it is. It's actually quite insulting. And truly, my question is always, you know, what exactly did you think I would sound like? And I remember reading a comment by a gentleman who is Asian, And this was the comment he heard was, wow, you're so articulate. And he said, well, I would think so. I was born here in America. That was his response. But again, it's not reserved just for Black people. You hear comments like, wow, she speaks such clear English, or you can't even detect an accent. Like, those are not compliments. So what if someone has an accent? Accents are beautiful. It shows diversity. Everyone is not the same. And when you make a comment like that, you're almost assuming that everyone should just sound European or American with no accent, or white. And to sound any other way is somehow a mark against you. So I would say, I'm just starting with those 5, I'm going to leave it there, are microaggressions. And if somehow, even well-intentioned, you've said some of these things or done some of these things, this is a learning opportunity that it is viewed differently if you're on the receiving end of some of those comments.
So, April, how about this? How about somebody ask you if they know somebody else who's Black just because you're Black?
Oh,
Is that another one?
Yes. Or making sure
Do you know
that
so and so?
Yes, or that they introduce you intentionally to all the other Black people they know, like you don't know Black people. Introduce me to everyone, the same as you would everyone else. I do get that a lot, and I see that a lot. I also see organizations that will hire someone who is of color and push them out there like a semi-mascot. They're in the marketing material, they're front and center everywhere. They want to invite them to everything to kind of display them as, yes, we have diversity, we are diverse. And again, there's no feeling good on the receiving side of that. None.
No,
you feel like a token.
Right. You know, that point you made of you have a diverse workforce, you know, it looks diverse, but when you're at the decision-making table, you're not given any vote, you're not listened to, your ideas are not responded to, and then it's somebody else's idea and they take the credit for it. Absolutely. You know, bringing someone in and hiring them and saying, here's our diversity hire, parading them around on all of the appointments that you go to show, look, we're a diverse workplace. You might as well not hire that person
100%
if that's
agree.
what you're going to do, because you're setting them up for failure, and you're also saying to them, this is why you were hired, not for your brain, not for your academic success and your achievements and your experiences. Don't even bother. And so I think that's so important. And you see, you know, businesses are looking for DEI, and they want to give you their business, and they want to see metrics. And some of them, like particularly in our industry, we want to see those folks billing on our files. You know, it's so transparent unless it is all the way through, and it's not diversity. You know, it's that this person was hired for their abilities. Don't refer to people as diversity hire. You're earmarking them from when they walk in. So I completely agree.
100%.
You know, so there's another question for you, Rachel. I don't know what's happening with me with the names.
Rachel, April.
I've called Rachel. I've called y'all. I mean, I think I'm like trying to squeeze y'all's names together and then adding. I think it's Wordle. I think Wordle is also happening to me. That all these letters. No, April and I have had tons of conversations. I've been on her committee, so I know April. So Jamie Fivecoat asks, how do you deal with the incongruity of policy and processes that may be in conflict with a leader's personal beliefs that may be clearly expressed outside of work?
Yeah, so that's a tough one, and I'll tell you why it is. And I talk a lot about culture, and culture is generally established by the senior-most person or people, and it is often based on 4 elements. And this just comes from my experience as a consultant and working with a few more than 1,000 organizations, one-on-one, and then a hotline hearing employees one-on-one. Okay, so culture is established by that senior-most person in what they accept, what they expect, what they reward, and what they discipline. And anything that goes against that creates a subculture where people have to reside, most of us. And part of that subculture, the people within your range, 5 people typically, and 1 is usually a supervisor, they're either going to go along with that culture or they're going to run counter to it and establish their own. So if you already have a person in leadership that is trying to play both sides, trying to create a culture while living in a subculture, it literally is not going to line up. It creates so much conflict. And without that training on how to have a difficult conversation, honestly, oftentimes people won't talk about it at all.
That's right.
That's a challenge. That's a cultural thing. And I can talk about that, a little bit offline, but yeah, that's challenging.
No, that's right. And that's a great question. And y'all, I'll tell you, that came from Jamie Fivecoat. And to Brandi's point about having folks talk to you and do training that are from the demographic, Jamie is an LGBTQ plus woman in the workplace. And so she's going to have a lot in June to share. So thank you, Jamie. And thank you everybody for your questions. I'm going to make a comment about the chat and observation. So lots of folks would answer the question about what is your workplace doing for DEI? The second question is, how are you having the conversations? Let me get to it. How does your workplace create a safe space for employees to engage in company-sanctioned, open, and frank discussions about issues they face, questions they have, and their experiences from a DEI or differences perspective? And no answers to that. And that's exactly what we thought. That's what we thought, is that there are efforts. People don't know how to start the conversation. And so takeaways, Brandi, anything else to add for the group? I'll start with you, and then I'll get to you, April.
Takeaways, continue
or
to
anything
have
you want to just throw out. Yeah.
Well, I think that continue to have courageous conversations and continue, we all need to model the workplace and the culture that we want to work in, right? And I think that I love that it starts at the top. That's 100% right. But I do think even if you're not at the top, you can influence it, and to remember that we all play a role in what our workplace culture, what it's like, the things we ask for, and the ways that we stand with our fellow colleagues. So I think continuing having those conversations, looking for resources. And the biggest thing to me, and many of you may already have this, but have an actual action plan that has measurables that you can hold yourself and your company accountable. Because it is one thing to say that you want this or you're creating this, but we all know that we get busy. We all know that we're working really hard. And I just feel like if it's not written down and people can't see it, then it's really hard to make it happen. So that was a hodgepodge of things, but
those great points all. Great points all.
Yeah.
What about you, April? What you got?
I would 100% agree with what Brandi said, and to piggyback on that, be sure to establish a DEI committee that's charged with meeting the end goal of the initiative and keeping things to the forefront. I'd love seeing in the comments that there were some organizations that had a DEI committee or council, and that should be part of their charge. That keeps it sustainable. It allows for focus on different communities under the diversity umbrella. I think it's a brilliant idea.
Absolutely necessary. I completely agree. And important then, the workplace to support the committee. Don't sideline them, implement what they're doing. Give them the tools and the resources they need to achieve what they are seeking. So great. Thank you both so much. I'm honored to have gotten an opportunity to appear with either of y'all as a presenter. So I'm just tickled to death that you came. Thank you, April. Thank you, Brandi. Note that I remembered your names at this time. I know your names. I know y'all personally. And so I am popping up here on the resources page. You see we've got some resources there for you. April's written a great letter about why DEI initiatives fail, a great article. I would encourage you to read it. And then we've got some other articles here that'll be helpful. But just thank you so much. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for presenting and for all of the great and valuable information that you two took the time to share with our group today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining this webinar presented by Haynsworth Sinkler Boyd. To learn more about the firm and its services, visit hsblawfirm.com.